The only time that your transmission line is not an impedance transformer is when there is a perfect match, which is not the usual case for most radio operators. That means no standing waves, which means no reflected power from the load. And there are an infinite number of impedances as you travel along the line. And that's where many hams and CB operators get it wrong. They think the SWR is changing, but it's really the impedance. SWR does not change along a transmission line. It is set by the match between the line and the load. So, if you're using 50 ohm coax and your antenna has an impedance of 100 ohms, your SWR is 2-to-1, period. Well, why, if I connect my SWR meter at a different place in the line, it gives me a different reading? Well, first, SWR meters are not exactly laboratory-grade instruments. They're good enough for what hams use them for, but two different meters might give you two different readings. Also, certain conditions can cause a meter to give a faulty reading. Common mode current, which is unwanted current on the shield of the coax cable, and a long transmission line with a lot of loss. Now, barring those conditions, an SWR meter will read pretty much the same, no matter where it's connected. Note this from the book Reflections, Transmission Lines and Antennas, written by antenna engineer Walt Maxwell, W2DU. SWR indicators need not be placed at the junction of the feed line and the antenna to obtain a more accurate measurement. Within its own accuracy limits, the indicator reads the SWR wherever it is located in the line. Let's look at an antenna system with no standing waves, that is, no reflected power. Here we have a transmitter output, which is 50 ohms, a coax line, which is 50 ohms, RG8, and an antenna that is 50 ohms at the feed point. Now, in this situation, there's no reflected power. All the power is absorbed by the load. There are no standing waves on the line, and the line's impedance is constant along its length, 50 ohms. Now, this arrangement makes sense for a commercial AM radio station, for example. A radio station only operates on one frequency. Now, that is not the case for ham and CB radio operators. Usually, a CBer might tune his antenna for a channel in the middle of the band. That should give you something like the situation we just described, a commercial radio station, little or no reflected power, no standing waves. But as soon as you switch to another channel, that is no longer the case. You are no longer on that antenna's resonant frequency. If someone says his antenna is perfectly resonant across the CB band or any ham band, he is mistaken. If you're a ham and you tune across the 80-meter band and your SWR hardly changes, there's something wrong with your antenna system. Now, for hams, the situation's different. We operate across a very wide range of frequencies. We often use different antennas for different bands, like one antenna for 160 meters, one for 80 meters, and another antenna for higher frequencies like 20, 15, and 10 meters. Or one really long wire and a tuner that works all the bands. So we hams, we have transmission lines with standing waves, which are caused by reflected power. Now, since SWR does not change along a line, why does impedance change in a line with reflected power? Let's call the power from the transmitter the incident power, and the reflected wave reflected power. So you have two different RF waves traveling in opposite directions in the line. The incident RF wave toward the load and the reflected wave back to the source, the transmitter. It's like two cars traveling in opposite directions passing on a two-lane highway. Now, as these voltages and currents slide past each other, they continuously add and subtract. At the place where the voltages combine to a maximum, we have a voltage standing wave. Same for current. There are voltage and current standing waves separate from each other. Why are they separate? In a reflected wave, the voltage and current are out of phase, which means reactance is now part of the impedance calculation. Why are these voltage and current maximums called standing waves? Well, for a given frequency, they stay in one place on the line. They don't move forward like the incident wave or back like the reflected wave. So they just stand there. They're standing waves. Here's a drawing showing only the upper half of a voltage cycle in an RF wave. Here is the incident voltage, this voltage peak right here, moving toward the load. And this smaller voltage peak here, this represents the reflected wave heading this way, back toward the source. Now, at some point, they are going to be in phase with each other, like we see here. Like two cars traveling in opposite directions when they are both adjacent to each other. These two voltages are going to add at this point, creating this standing wave. So again, those standing waves for any given frequency, they don't move this way or that way, unlike the incident voltage and the reflected voltage, which are both traveling in opposite directions in the line. The standing waves, they just stand there. Now, we all know from Ohm's law that resistance equals voltage divided by current. So, since the relationship between voltage and current is constantly changing as these RF waves slide past each other, we have a constantly changing impedance as we travel along the line. So in conclusion, SWR on a line does not change for a given frequency, but there are an infinite number of impedances as voltages and currents move in opposite directions, adding and subtracting. Now let's say your tuner won't tune an antenna, but if you add or subtract some coax, it will tune. Well, you have not changed the SWR, you've changed the impedance. There's something your tuner can more easily deal with. Now, the beauty of a coax line with infinite impedances that with the help of a tuner, we can change the impedance seen by the transmitter to 50 ohms and tune the entire antenna system to resonance. Now, since that's the case, full power is delivered to the load despite SWR, minus cable losses, which in the HF bands isn't usually an issue. So we can, for example, use one long wire to work multiple frequencies and bands. Now, without RF reflections, that can't be done. So SWR isn't a bad thing. Consider subscribing to this channel in 73.